Okay, so we're gonna get started because we have a lot to talk about, and the less I talk, the more we have for everyone who you want to hear from talk. My name is Stefan Kim. I'm with Eyewitness News, Channel 7, but before that, I spent almost 3 wonderful years in Westchester, News 12, so it's like a homecoming. I have interviewed many legal experts in this law school, so this feels kind of cool. You know, thank you for coming. Thank you to the county, actually, for commissioning this study. I just came from Midtown at an event for the UN ambassador, and we were talking about the struggles and the challenges that the AAPI community faces. And so much of that is just not knowing the resources that are there and not knowing from the government side the resources that need to be provided because we don't know what they need. And so I said that in that panel, I'm actually shooting up to Westchester tonight to talk about this very issue, and they have done the very thing that would bridge that gap, right? Spending this time, the past year or so, commissioning this study to find those answers. It's the first time that we've done this, is my understanding. I'm super interested and curious to see what we're gonna learn, and hopefully you guys are too. So number one, thank you to the county executive, George Latimer, for even putting the political willpower behind a commission like this, study like this. So that's the first of its kind, so thank you. And before we hear from him, though, I do want to bring up to the podium someone who we would not be literally in this space without, the dean of this law school, Horace Anderson. Is he here? How are you, sir? This is your house. The floor is now yours, sir. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Stefan. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try that again. I usually expect more of a response in this room. Good evening, everyone. I'm Horace Anderson. I'm the dean here at the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. I want to welcome you here. I want to thank you for coming. First of all, I want to thank the county and the county executive for giving us this particular reason to get together. I got to tell you that my family, including my wife's side of the family and my side of the family, come from a number of places, islands in the Caribbean and states in the American South. And I am always personally struck by the fact that we could be marginalized as being too new here and too different, and also be marginalized even after having been in this country for generations. And I think a lot of the people in this room can understand where I'm coming from with that. And so the commissioning of this report is important to doing the sorts of things that are important to us here at the law school. And that's one of the reasons I was so happy to host. The solution to any problem starts with identifying the problem and taking the time and putting the resources behind a report like the one that we're going to hear about this evening is a huge, huge step that I don't think quite frankly, many counties in this country are ready to take. So I'm glad that Westchester has done so. I'm happy to host also because since I've become dean, it's been one of my goals to make our law school, I'm going to now quote my friend Mayo Bartlett in the back, a hub of good things and a forum, a town hall for discussion of and even wrestling with the important issues of our day. I think that's an important part of our students' education. It's also an important part of our mission and our contribution to the community. So it was a no-brainer for me to say yes to hosting. And so I say welcome. Hope you've enjoyed the food, and now we are going to enjoy some food for thought. Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned, years ago, I used to work at News 12. Back when I knew him, he was not county executive. So both of us have kind of moved on, right? It's a good job, right? So let's hear from the county executive. Again, thank you. We're here because of him. So
And Stefan, we get great pride when we see you in New York City-based media because we feel like we own you. You were here beforehand. But good evening, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here tonight. I'm pleased to be joined by many members of my county team. I'm going to pull out my notes because when you start to go through a list of people, the people you forget get very mad at you that somehow you forgot them off the chart. You're going to hear in a few minutes, and he's going to get more than one round of applause, but we'll let him have the first one of the night. The first elected Asian American Westchester County legislator, David Imamura, is here. And from our executive branch, we have Ken Jenkins, our deputy county executive. Joan McDonald, who's our director of operations. Emily Saltzman's our deputy director of operations. These are the people that actually run the county government, so we really ought to clap for them. I have with us here Martha Lopez, who is our director of program and policy. Our director of communications, Catherine Chaffee. Director of Research, Ellen Hendricks. We don't really hire too many men, do we? We have the leader of our Human Rights Commission, our Executive Director, Tejas Sanchala. And I believe I have listed Michael Orth, our Commissioner of Mental Health, if he's here or will be here shortly. There he is, he's here. Thank you, Michael, right up front. And we're very fortunate to have these people and more involved in what we do. And, you know, every time, you know, people will say, well, the county executive showed leadership. Let me assure you that it's the combination of people that you bring around you that accomplishes these goals. I learned a long time ago when I worked in a corporate setting that the single most important task of a leader is to hire people who complement whatever skill set you think you have and brings additional skills around the table. So if you're not schooled in the law, which I am not, if you're not an experienced administrator of large government bureaucracies, which I am not, if I am not a crackerjack communicator, which I am not, then you hire people and you bring people in and you create a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So when I go through a list like that, that's just not obligatory. That's because I have deep respect for these people and others that are outside of this room tonight, which really help contribute in the direction that we want to try to bring this county. The study in the report, which we're going to talk about more, I'll leave that to Marjorie Hsu and some other folks who are here, are going to get into some very important specific things. It's important to note that the increase in the Asian American Pacific Islander community has rose by 32% over the course of the 10 years from the 2010 to the 2020 census. No ethnic group had that type of population explosion. And that is an important statement of what this community means in Westchester County. It's important to note that we have challenges in a host of different areas in public transportation as relates to this community, and clearly in public safety and dealing with incidents of hatred and prejudice directed to this community. We have the responsibility to bridge the language gap which exists. And we also know that in the AAPI community, we're dealing with many different languages that comprise the native language of people who identify in this area. And so we have to be able to do things in a multiple way in Chinese and Korean and Japanese and other languages. But overall, there's something that's more important than some of these specifics. And the report is only one step in a direction. We obviously hope that we will be as diligent as implementing the good ideas that are in this report and to think through how we do additional things as in addition to reading and accepting a document. It's remembering what the problem is underneath all of this that the AAPI community faces, and by extension, the Hispanic community, the African-American community, the Arab American community. I was in corporate life for 20 years. I served in sales and marketing capacities for a couple of major corporations and some smaller corporations in that time in the same basic field. And one of the companies I worked for was a wholly owned American subsidiary of a multinational corporation. And it was always a big deal when the suits came in from overseas. The parent company was based in Switzerland. And there would be some number of us from the president of the corporation, we'd call it a division if that's what they would have called it, the president and then the regional VPs and the VP of sales and marketing. I was a regional director of sales and marketing, and you know the corporate suits would come in and they would give us direction and ask us how we're doing on numbers and ask us penetrating questions and serious questions. And these were not trivial business people. And I remember distinctly in one of these meetings, I was probably about 32 at the time. I'm almost 70 now. And there was a question that came up, and my immediate boss turned to me, to sort of have the answer, because I did have the answer. I knew how a couple of these projects were working. And so with the greatest amount of diligent communications, the stuff I try to show now, I explained the circumstances. And there was no response. And the senior manager that came in from overseas looked right through me. And I acknowledged it, and I didn't obviously was going to say anything about it. I'm at best a junior executive in that room, but I realized that I meant nothing to him. He saw right through me. And I talked about that with my immediate boss, who's vice president of sales and marketing, when he got out there, and he said, look, this is how it is. You could have the brightest ideas in the world, but if you don't register in that person's mindset, you don't exist. And I thought about that. I've never told that story recently. I've had no reason to tell it, but I tell it tonight because for so many years, those people who trace their heritage back to China, to Japan, to Korea, to the Philippine Islands, to Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, were invisible. They're visible, but invisible, lumped together by being the other. And I'm sure that my friends who are of Hispanic heritage felt the same way. Martha Lopez is here, and she has a story that she could tell along these lines. And I'm sure that that is true for my friends who are African American in their experience in this American nation. And were we to have somebody who is a Native American? Because as much as we have, and we will be celebrating in a few years the 250th anniversary of this country, it's a great country, greatest country in the history of the world. But we still have had a blind spot to the other. Can't see them. Don't weigh them with proper weight. What I understood in my business life, and what I took from that, is that if we want to be successful in a corporate setting, we want to sell our product or service at a profit. And in many ways, we really don't care who buys that service, as long as they buy it at the price that we structure and the revenue exceeds the expense. It sounds funny coming out of a politician's mouth, but I actually had this experience. I know George Santos's resume might not have been accurate, but mine is. But you apply that now in this world that we live in this community world that we live in. And given what I see in Westchester County, I don't think this takes deep vision. The future of this county, speaking as a white, male, Christian, old, right-handed, part of straight, part of every majority group you can think of, what I realize is the future of this county. I could argue at larger jurisdictions, but I'll stay with in my lane. The future of this county is building on the diversity, is accepting and including and making part of the we in Westchester, the Asian American, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, African American, Arab American community as part of a we. And that we will rise us economically. And it is a moral good, but it's an economic good. It's a social good. It's good on every level of it. So what we try to do, and we're trying to do in this particular case, is to reorient our minds, those of us who are not part of this community, to see you, to understand that you exist. You have a narrative. You have a different narrative than other people do, but it's a legitimate narrative, wherever your heritage comes from, whatever experiences you've had. Some of those experiences in America may trace back to Japanese internment during World War II. Some of that might have been affected by the legislation for the 1860s, I think it was, the Chinese Exclusion Act. But whatever it is, we start today. We start with every step we make today to broaden the base of who we are as a country and as a county. And we accept each other for the talent that we have, for the contribution that we have as brothers and sisters. That is probably an aspiration that goes beyond the language barriers that we have to breach and the job opportunities that we have to breach. But as John F. Kennedy said in one of his great speeches, he said, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Let us begin. Let us begin.
Mr. County Executive, I don't know if you saw, but George Santos on his resume says he commissioned this study the year before you did. There. No, but in all seriousness, Mr. County Executive, thank you for seeing us. I think that's all we ever asked for. And so this is a giant step towards that. And so with that being said, I'd like to welcome to the podium Marjorie Sue, who will now present for us the long-awaited findings. Marjorie.
Lower the mic. Good evening. How's everyone doing? So welcome to the Westchester County AAPI Heritage Month celebration. My name is Marjorie Shu, and it is my pleasure to be the co-chair of the Asian American Advisory Board. And I will provide you with a synopsis of the community needs assessment that we did last year. I want to thank Safan for joining us this evening as our Masters of Ceremony, and he will be moderating our 2 panel discussions. Of course, I'd like to thank Pace University and Dean Anderson and his staff for hosting us this evening, and County Executive George Latimer and his team that have worked tirelessly over several years in working on this survey with us. And so thank you very much. I want to acknowledge all the community partners who guided us in this effort. And then, of course, our AAAB, as I call the Asian American Advisory Board members, who staffed every ethnic festival, harassed their friends, community-based organizations, their temples, their churches, their language schools, to assure that we included as many voices in this community needs assessment as possible. And huge appreciation to Dr. Sheila Klatsky, who partnered with us to design the survey and authored the report on our behalf. So there's copies of the report and this presentation, as well as the mental health presentation scattered throughout the room. But for those of you that would prefer a digital copy, there's a QR code, and you can just hold your phone's camera up to this QR code and you can access these slides. You can access the 117-page report that you can read later tonight, and all the other information and resources that are available online. I ask that not only do you read it, but please share it with the other members in our community. I'm very grateful for the Hispanic Advisory Board for being here this evening. I'm sure we have common challenges and opportunities between our 2 communities. And we really need to share the information with our broader community and our allies, because they're the ones that are going to help us fix some of these problems. And we need to understand we have very disparate needs within the AAPI community, and that we're not just about Bali and Lunar New Year and, you know, delicious foods. So just wanted to make note that the 2020 census gave us the baseline to understand the huge demographic shifts in the AAPI community here as well as nationwide. But it was really our AAAB needs assessment that gave us these incredible insights that we can base now policy changes on so that we better serve all marginalized communities. We also gleaned some data points from the Westchester Community Foundation Westchester Index. So thank you for our partners at WCF. And as I said, our AAAB board members really hit the pavement. We collected 838 survey responses, over which over 500 were fully completed. So we achieved our goal of hearing from 1% of our Asian community in Westchester County, which I think is a huge accomplishment. Dr. Klatsky, as I said, longtime county resident and expert research consultant who's done similar projects for other groups such as the Westchester Women's Agenda, authored the report. We also worked with the county to have the survey translated into 6 Asian languages. And that really paid off because we got 73 responses in Korean, 23 responses in Chinese, 21 in Japanese, and just 1 in Hindi. We kind of over-indexed with Chinese and Korean responses, and that was intentional because we wanted to make sure that we did a specific outreach to seniors in our community, the folks that are underserved. So a couple of us board members went to a affordable housing unit in Yonkers that is now majority Koreans, and we spent hours, Martha, myself, and Jin, helping Korean seniors respond to the survey in Korean. I don't even speak Korean. And that's how great the survey was. It was very easy to use. And similarly, Lillian and Bill were at the Evergreen Chinese Senior Center in Greenberg, similarly helping Chinese seniors respond to their survey in language. So I do think it's worth noting that as I was going around in my local community in Sleepy Hollow, I couldn't get the survey input from some of the local business owners in Sleepy Hollow because these owners of nail salons and dry cleaning businesses, they don't actually live in Westchester County. There's probably over 1,000 people that commute into Westchester to provide us services because they can't afford to live in Westchester County. So this is, I think, notable. So as George mentioned, the Asian population, which had a 32% increase between the 2010 and the 2020 census, is the second fastest growing ethnicity in Westchester, behind the Hispanic population. Elsewhere in New York and the rest of the country, as well as North America, Asians are actually the fastest growing ethnicity. So Asians are literally everything everywhere all at once. In Westchester, we're 8% of the population, 8% of Westchester, 80,000 AAPI live here. And what's really astounding is as you look at the graph on the top, the 61% growth of multi-race Asians. So these are kids like mine that are mixed race, Chinese, and Caucasian, and like a lot of the children of our AAAB board members. So there's a lot of happies out there that are really driving the growth in our county. And meanwhile, whites have declined from 68% to 53% between the two census in 2010 and 2020. And so Westchester is on the brink of becoming a majority minority county, which is quite fascinating. So how are we made up in terms of nationalities? South Asians are the largest chunk of the pie at 34% of Asians in Westchester. What's interesting is that South Asians only make up 19% of Asians in New York City and just 23% of Asians in the rest of the US. Conversely, while Chinese are 23% of the Asians here in Westchester, Chinese are a whopping 49% of Asians in New York City and 24% of Asians in the rest of the US. So East Asians are the fastest growing ethnic demographic in Westchester. And what's also I thought interesting was that 68% of Asians in Westchester are first generation, like myself. So this map of Westchester, courtesy of Howard Shee on our board, it's a little hard to read on this screen, but obviously the darker municipalities are the ones that have higher concentrations of Asians living there. Tabular data might be a little bit easier to look at. So what's startling is that 1 in every 5 people living in Scarsdale is Asian. So that's substantial. And then these are the municipalities with high percentage of Asians living there, including Greenberg, which has over 7,000 Asians. And then at the bottom, even though percentage-wise it's not as large, Yonkers, our largest city in Westchester, actually has the biggest number of Asians, almost 13,000 living in Yonkers. So median household income, clearly from this chart, economically, Asian Americans are doing well in Westchester, even better than elsewhere in the United States, with South Asians earning the highest median income both here in our county as well as nationwide. Westchester Asians are a little bit younger than the county as a whole, and more educational attainment. 72% of Westchester Asians have attained a bachelor's degree or higher versus 50% of the rest of the county at large as a whole. And then that 72% is compared to 43% of New York City Asians and 55% of the rest of the US have attained similar levels of bachelor's or above in terms of their education. So higher education obviously correlates with higher income. Some of the largest companies in Westchester, Regeneron, who's here today, and IBM, and the many hospitals employ many of these well-educated. Many Asians come to the US for graduate studies, so that's just going to skew Asians toward higher educational attainment. And one thing that I learned when I was board chair of the Asian American Federation in New York City is that AAPI always over-index in entrepreneurship. So 11.1% of the businesses in Westchester are Asian owned, even though we only make up 8% of the population. And then Asians also have the lowest unemployment rate of any ethnic group. All heard about the model minority myth coined in the 1960s at UC Berkeley, which puts undue pressure on our community and has caused a wedge with other communities of color. We see this happening now in Florida, where AAPI history has been mandated in K through 12 public schools. And at the same time, an AP African Americans course has been rejected. So civil rights and AAPI advocates perceive this as a blatant attempt to divide communities of color in the Sunshine State. So this serves as a reminder as we're doing our work on the policy level and the implementation level that we need to, here in Westchester, uplift all marginalized communities while we celebrate the increasingly diverse makeup of our neighbors. So this model mythology is a disservice to underserved Asians because it really obscures the poverty in our community amidst all the affluence. There are 4,000 Asians, 6.5% living in poverty. And it's a dramatic 59% increase in the poverty rate of Asians in Westchester since the 2010 census. A report authored by one of our board members, Howard Shee, while he was the research and policy director at the Asian American Federation, indicates that Hudson Valley had the greatest percentage increase in AAPI poverty rates between 2010 and 2019. 11% of our seniors, Asian seniors, are living in poverty, the second poorest behind Black seniors, who are at 16%, and then whites and Hispanics are at 6% poverty rate for seniors in Westchester. Asian seniors as a whole are nearly twice as likely to not have Medicare coverage, which they're entitled to, probably due to lack of awareness, language barriers, cultural isolation, and similarly, only 3.6% of Asian households are collecting food stamps and SNAP benefits, which is quite heartbreaking. So these were the major findings in our report. Some of them reinforced things we already knew. Others were kind of surprising, honestly. So let me get into the specifics. So the big headline of anti-Asian hate. This has been a dual epidemic that the Asian community has faced nationwide in these last 3 years. COVID and anti-Asian hate, and the hate, doesn't have, unfortunately, a vaccine. And the anti-Asian incidents are continuing unabated, even though the media cycles have moved on. So we don't know that there's still anti-Asian physical, verbal, microaggressions, bullying continuing at the same pace as the last 3 years. Racist and physical attacks, especially against the most vulnerable in our community, women and seniors, and also bullying of our kids, is really despicable, and we really have to stop it. We have had 2 attacks on Asian senior women in Westchester the last couple of years, and 10% of our survey respondents experienced some sort of hate incident. However, 3/4 of our respondents and 70% of our seniors are concerned about a future attack. So people are feeling anxious and paranoid about their personal safety, which is very, very sad. Working with Westchester County and the AAAB, we promoted a Stand Up Westchester campaign to encourage people to report racial incidents to either the Human Rights Commission under Tejas' leadership, as well as the District Attorney's Office. Our newest county legislator, first Asian ever, David Imamura, will give an update on the discriminatory harassment law that he spearheaded with the HRC and passed while he was co-chair with me of the Asian American Advisory Board. Education is always a hugely important topic for our community, and Asians have expressed a need for improvement in our school curriculum. Our history in this country is not being taught in schools. The earliest Asians came to this country in the late 1500s as Filipino fishermen in Ghana. So we've been here a really, really long time. And many of the significant contributions to American society, as well as the injustices that County Executive Latimer mentioned, the Japanese internment, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was uniquely targeting one nationality in 18. They're not taught in schools. I didn't learn about them. I'm embarrassed to say that I only learned about these things pretty recently. Our hope is that better multicultural education curriculum will combat the ongoing racism and hate against Asians and all religions, ethnicities, gender, and sexual orientation. Our last panel of the evening will discuss what will what it'll take from a policy and implementation perspective to get Asian American history into public school curriculum. The language access is a unique challenge for the Asian American community. Can everyone hear me okay? So a quarter of Asians in Westchester speak English less than very well. While no ethnic community is a monolith, it's a unique challenge to us because there's 15 languages and over 2,000 dialects of Asian languages. And so it's a challenge for the AAPI community, and it's a challenge for organizations that are trying to serve us better than they are today. So if you're not English proficient, everything obviously is more difficult. Accessing services, if you're a small business owner applying for grants during the pandemic, getting vaccinated, finding doctors, getting legal assistance, finding a job. So language access is a particular opportunity for us in the county, as there's so many services that the county provides. We just need to make sure we inventory all those services and make language accessible to this increasing. So even though there's all these jokes about Asians pressuring their kids to become doctors, in fact, there are very few Asian-speaking doctors and therapists in Westchester. People are traveling to Queens and traveling to Connecticut for culturally appropriate in-language care. Our county health commissioner, Michael Orth, and Dr. Teresa Shuwackett will speak about the particular challenges in the behavioral health arena and how Asian are, struggling to access good behavioral health care also later this evening. The public transport, honestly, this was a aha for me, that Asians want better public transportation in Westchester. There are seniors living in South Westchester, having moved here from Queens to get more affordable housing. But it's also grandparents living with adult children and their grandchildren in some of the more spread out communities and suburbs, and not being able to get to their doctor, to the grocery store, to the community centers. And this is because their sandwich generation children are working the whole day and there's no one to drive them to their destinations. Again, one of our board members, Howard, is overlaying where Asians live in Westchester on the public bus routes to see how that maps. So more to come on this particular opportunity. So it all culminates in this social support, and all the topics that I've touched on thus far are obviously, intersecting and impact one another. But if you don't speak English well, you don't have access to public transportation, you don't drive, you can't find culturally appropriate food if you're food insecure, you're not finding professionals that speak your language. It all exacerbates the sense of trust and belonging in Westchester County. So we already have this epidemic that we're all reading about of mental health, loneliness, and isolation. But just imagine what it must feel like to be a recent immigrant or a senior who doesn't speak English. You have the India Center in Hawthorne, and we have the Greenberg Evergreen Center, where some members of our community do come together. Of course, there's many religious institutions and language schools, have cultural festivals at Kensko Dam, but otherwise there's few opportunities for Asians to come together and to be together. Of course, the most disadvantaged of any of us are the undocumented Asians, which we don't have a lot of data on for obvious reasons. And this data comes from the Migration Policy Institute. Where do we go from here? I've kind of laid out the agenda for you already this evening. As I said, the last panel, whose names I haven't mentioned thus far, our Regent Francis Wills from our Board of Regents, Senator Shelley Mayer's Chief of Staff, Rachel Estroff. Shelley wanted to be here, but she's in Albany today in session. The Ardsley Superintendent, Ryan Schoenfeld, and then Julie Chin of Make Us Visible. I'm going to ask the AAAB board members to stand up and be acknowledged. You can ask them all the hard questions. So the QR code should take you to all of these resources, as I mentioned. It's a fully agenda, so we're going to reserve the end of the evening for a general Q&A that Safan will moderate. So thank you so much for your attention and your ongoing engagement to help us improve the well-being for all underserved members of our community. And without further ado, let me introduce legislator David Imamura.
Everyone give it up for Marjorie Shu. So I will say, I do not think I realized how truly valuable and amazing this report was until I was elected to office, right? Because when you're an elected official, people come to you with problems and it's kind of hard to discern exactly who is having a problem, what the problems are, and how to solve it. And in this report, in this needs assessment, Marjorie and the AAAB have met all three. So thank you so much, Marjorie. Thank you so much to the AAAB members who are out there in the rain, in this heat to get this done. So thank you all so much. It was truly incredible. And I just want to pause and say how proud I am to live here in Westchester. I mean, at a time where our neighboring suburban counties, Suffolk, Nassau, Rockland, Orange County, are literally declaring states of emergency to prevent migrants from coming to Westchester. Westchester is stepping up and saying, how can we help you? While others are closing their doors, Westchester is opening up. Right? And I think that manifests itself in George Latimer's policies at this moment. And I think it manifests itself in this report and the actions that the county government has taken. So when I became co-chair of the AAAB, quite unwillingly, back in 2021 with Marjorie, Marjorie and I actually came to kind of a rough division of labor, right? Marjorie was going to focus on the data, on putting together a needs assessment that then became this 2-year labor of love. And I was going to focus on creating legislation that tried to combat Asian hate, right? So lawyer versus the engineer, exactly. Engineer is definitely more useful. And so, and everyone remembers this, coming out of the shootings in Atlanta, there was this real question of, did the law protect Asian Americans? And as someone where every single female member of my family has at some point been attacked on the subway or on the street, there's this real question for me of, does the law actually protect people in those situations, right? If you're walking down the street and someone throws an egg at you and says, go back to China, does the law protect you? And the answer was, not really, right? Like you had your own you could bring your own private claims, but the state and the county didn't have any laws that protected you from their perspective, right? And so we decided, Tejas Sanchala, who's here, where are you, Tejas? Okay, yes, there you are. Tejas Sanchala told us about how New York City had what was called a discriminatory harassment law, which is the equivalent of like a civil hate crimes, right? If someone does something to you with discriminatory intent, and it's paired with some other action, that will be discriminatory harassment, right? If I am trying to get on a bus and someone keeps me from getting onto the bus and says, go back to China, that is discriminatory harassment, right? And so in this environment in which we were in this environment where we knew that Asian Americans were being victimized purely because of association with coronavirus, purely because of what they look like, we passed this law that prevents people from doing it, right? That gives the Human Rights Commission the authority to investigate these instances, right? And there was a groundbreaking law. And the problem with it is that no one really understands it because it's really complicated to explain, right? But what I would urge everyone here to do is, if you hear about someone having what you view as some kind of discriminatory incident, you should call the Westchester Human Rights Commission, right? Because they will be able to tell you, yes, this is something that is actionable. Yes, we can take action to help protect you, right? Because otherwise, it will just be part of the vast majority of hate incidents that we know go underreported, right? All of my family members who have had incidents, it never occurred to them to go to the government. It never occurred to them to go to the county or the state, right? And so that's what I would say here, right? Is that this law is groundbreaking, right? It, for the first time, creates a civil penalty for hate, right? In areas that beyond physical violence, right? Because that's where most hate occurs, right? It's not, there are people who are being attacked physically, right? But a lot of it is, kind of, left, one step down, right? And those are the exact acts that we try to outlaw with this discriminatory action, harassment. So I want to thank Tejan Chala for doing the groundwork on the incredible work on this. It never would have occurred to me with Marjorie that we'd be able to pass a law faster than we were able to do a data assessment. But we did it, and we did it only because of Teja's work, because of the work of the Westchester County Legislature, which I wasn't a member of yet, and of George Latimer, right? Because, and I think it's indicative of all the things I just said, that we live in the county that is accepting and that wants to promote diversity. So again, thank you all so much. So please, 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 if you take nothing else from my rambling discussion just now, if something happens, call the Human Rights Commission, right? Because the only way people will understand this, right, is if they speak up, right? So thank you so much. Again, thank you, Marjorie, and thank you all. I'm not taking it down.
Okay, let's get right to it. So I'm going to invite up to the stage. We have our two mental health experts here, Commissioner Orth and Dr. Teresa Su. Walk in, right? I'm going to sit with you. Close. All right. So I want to sort of start this way. I'm glad we talked about this. Margie talked about it a little bit. The model minority myth, right? You might ask why poverty is sort of connected to this discussion. And I know Westchester County has different data when it comes to poverty, and I understand that, but sort of a jarring statistic, if you will, in the city of New York, not very well known, but almost 1 in 4 AAPI New York City residents live under the poverty line. And that is actually slightly under the percentage of Hispanic New Yorkers and slightly above Black New Yorkers. I bring this up because my belief is when you live in poverty, you're vulnerable to all kinds of things like violence, food insecurity, lack of housing, and mental health struggles. And this also happens to be Mental Health Month, right? So I think this is timely, in fact, and it's no secret to many of us in this room, culturally, Asian Americans, Asians, we're not trained necessarily to publicly speak about mental health and mental health struggles. But also I want to sort of point this out. I think we often assume, and probably rightfully so, that a lot of this applies to our seniors. I did a story 2 years ago where, according to the CDC, 2 years ago, that was the data, the leading cause of death among American youth and teenagers was gun violence, but the leading cause of death among AAPI youth is suicide, which was just astounding to me. So I'll start with you, Commissioner. I mean, like, let's talk about this. Where does the county see, from the county's point of view, what is the biggest struggles the community faces when it comes to this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. Congratulations on the report. In one of our slides, we talk about without mental health, there can be no true physical health. And we all have mental health, and it's important that we practice mental wellness and support each other's mental health. I think one of the things that you mentioned is that along with biological and genetic predisposition to mental health, some of the factors of social determinants of health, like food insecurities, housing, violence that we talked about that are wonderfully articulated in the report, all lead to mental health concerns and issues. So one of the things I'm most proud about, our department is called the Department of Community Mental Health. Note, it's not Department of Health, but Community Mental Health. And in order for us to do the work that we do and really look at prevention, early interventions, it's imperative that we work with our local community partners, whether it's the faith, spiritual community, our school districts, because we all have a role to play in supporting our residents' mental wellness.
Arthur, your point of view. I mean, let's also talk about sort of, like, I understand what you're talking about, and this is a lot what the report discusses, like getting the information there. But there's sort of the other side of this too. Like in our homes, within our families, we don't talk about this, right? This is very stigmatized. How do we overcome that?
Well, I think as hear me?
Fine.
I can also talk very loudly. Well, I think as Michael was saying, a huge piece of this is recognizing that mental health is health. So normalizing it both for our different generations of people. So at the school level, for our teens in schools, for parents in our communities, normalizing it through I was talking to someone about having senior events and playing mahjong, talking about mental health in that sort of setting, so that it's just a normal part of the conversation. For our parents, it might be, for if you're going to your regular doctor, if the doctor's trained in recognizing that maybe stomach aches or headaches might be an indication of depression or anxiety, and kind of recognizing what those flags are, that can really go a long way in terms of picking up those symptoms at an earlier point.
Question can go to either of you, but sort of going back to my point about the seniors versus the youth, are we seeing different mental health struggles there? What are they? I mean, it doesn't seem to me that they're facing, like, the teenagers are not facing isolation, right? They're not facing language barriers. They're all over TikTok. I mean, they're certainly not isolated. Maybe that's a mental health issue. But are we seeing, what's the difference here, I guess? Are we seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing in general, and the pandemic had a lot to do with it, it did lead to social isolation, people feeling disconnected. So how can we reconnect people? How can we have a sense of safety and security? That's all part of emotional wellness for young people and for adults. For the adults, we definitely see more social isolation as well. And I think, as the doctor said, how do we incorporate that connectivity and really that emotional support that we all need in our communities?
So I actually saw an interview with Minjin Lee, who wrote Pachinko, and one of the things that she brought up that really resonated, and I think is a great point, is that if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So at the bottom, it's this pyramid of need, and at the bottom, there's food and shelter. And at the very top, there's self-actualization. So for many of our elderly, they spent so long trying to get their basic needs met, that our teens are at the top because our elderly provided everything for us to get to the point where our basic need is about self-actualization, right? It's about being our fullest self. And so even the problems look different because the seniors and the elderly are still in this traumatized state of, making sure we have enough food, making sure we're going to set ourselves up to have the best job, that will never need anything material again. Whereas our youngest generation is thinking about, how do I be the fullest and best self I can be?
So that leads into this question, right? Not only is it cultural, some of this, but to your point, the seniors, they didn't really have the time or the bandwidth to, right? They're surviving. So then I wonder, okay, so then our parents' generation, the generation in between, right? The generation of the parents of the teens today, you can't almost blame that generation because they never learned that, right? There was no example in the household for how to approach this topic. Is there a conversation to be had? And how was that conversation had with that generation on how to talk to their kids? Like, you know what I mean? Like some of this is internal, right? And how do the teenagers deal with this when they haven't seen two generations above them, right? So what do those conversations have to look like, I guess?
It's a great question. I think it still starts with the mental health is health conversation and really normalizing it. I will even share that I have two daughters and, a lot of it is around, even our conversations are, how are you doing today? How are you feeling? What happened? How did that make you feel?
We
What
don't
are
talk about feelings that much in our households.
We
Yeah.
talk a lot about feelings.
Feelings aren't really, yeah, that's good. Okay. So maybe that's a start, right? Like talk about feelings. Commissioner, anything sort of,
In a lot of the research about Asian American and connecting with mental health services, I think not unlike other cultures as well, if an individual is experiencing psychological distress, it's not only that person who's seeking help, but it also reflects the family and their vulnerability. And if we all believe that mental health is just as important as physical health, we need to normalize that conversation. It's not a weakness in character or weakness of family, but it's really allowing to get help just like we would if we had a broken arm. So I think, like you said, it's having the vocabulary, finding more culturally, linguistically competent ways to receive those services, which I think we have a lot of work to do in our country, in our county, and in our state. But it's normalizing and it's not a weakness of character.
I think just to add to that, it's not just about what's happening in the home, but in the communities as well. So if, they're going to school and it's normalized in school, right? So amongst teens, amongst TikTok, there's much greater normalization there than there might be in the home. But the more parents can, find those sources in the community as well, I think the greater support they would have to have those conversations at home as well.
okay. So let me ask you, I guess, sort of broader, maybe policy, because that's where you guys are sitting, right? What are the, I mean, I think you sort of talked about it, but, maybe outside of what you already mentioned, the biggest hurdles to, I guess, making the situation better. What's next? What should be next? From where you're sitting, what does that look like?
I think from the county perspective and working in public health, mental health, I think clearly we want to build a more culturally, linguistically competent workforce in terms of therapists, in terms of clinician. With that said, I think there's still opportunity. We call them credible messengers within a community or a culture, and that could be the spiritual faith-based leaders. It could be a school district. It could be the primary health system where people tend to have less stigma and will go for health supports. It's really trying to build capacity, learn from them as well, and how can we deliver more culturally, linguistically competent services. We will have a long way to go to build up enough linguistically competent therapists, but I think there's existing opportunities within Westchester to kind of reach out, learn from each other, how we can deliver these more culturally, linguistically competent services. That could be building workforce capacity, but it can also be delivering mental health services in a different way.
I think in the behavioral health side, both cultural competency and clinician competency are huge as well. So even within our field, many of the interventions were created by older white men. And so it's important to tailor those interventions so that it's much more tailored to the individual in whatever culture that they had grown up in.
So I guess, is there sort of tangible like outreach to, for lack of better words, retrain some of these mental health experts? Is that something that's happening? How do we even do that?
It's a very slow process, to be honest.
Okay.
I had just learned that there was one of the first of its kind at Columbia. There was a program for Spanish-speaking clinicians, how to actually do therapy in Spanish, because there are so many linguistic nuances. There's nothing like that for the Asian American population now.
And I just want to highlight again the importance of the faith-based spiritual community. Thanks to our county executive, we've also launched something called Faith Affirming Initiative. And we're working with, like, for example, Black churches delivering a soul shop curriculum, or working with the Jewish faith that really incorporates the rabbis, the faith-based leaders, to really embed mental health, mental wellness language within their sermon, within their faith-based community. And that has really grown to really be well received by communities. So that's just one example of working with faith, spirituality within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, that we can really build those connections stronger.
Right. And so to Michael's point, there's definitely light touch interventions on that level where community leaders can engage in a conversation that helps move the conversation forward, even if there aren't some of these more intense interventions, kind of evidence-based at this point.
Let me ask you a follow-up question that's sort of, I want you to be honest, and this, I don't know what the answer is. I completely understand the value of faith-based leaders being a part of this process, but I'm visualizing that faith-based leader right now, and guess what? They look like the community which has a problem or struggle with discussing this issue, right? Is there a lack of understanding or resistance even from those folks, right? Because they grew up in the same households that we did, right? Is there a conversion effort that needs to be made to even get them on board, or what is that conversation like?
I think the commonalities when we started working is that we're all in the healing business and really trying to support one another. So I think we mental health, spirituality, faith is all about healing, a place of safety and a place of comfort. So if we start having those conversations, we have grown to about 150 spiritual leaders within Westchester County alone who are immersed in this mental health collaborative.
Oh, interesting.
I think there's also something to be said about tailoring different interventions as well. So for example, we think of like self-care, it's very commoditized, right? It's been, I think I was talking to Marjorie the other day, it's been trivialized to like a mani-pedi, go get a manicure, go get a massage. That doesn't work necessarily for everybody Asian American community, but something that is a little bit more interdependent might work a little bit better. So for example, self-care for somebody might look like you make dinner and then you sit down and enjoy the dinner with your family. And I see, you're smiling because you probably are standing up the entire time, getting up, getting things for the dinner table and everything. Sit down with your family.
The other area of opportunity is working with primary care, because that's often where people come for services and maybe doing more mental health screening, early intervention and awareness that can link people. That also involves training primary care physicians on recognizing signs and symptoms of mental health as well. But that's an opportunity we can build on.
Okay, so as I asked you sort of your final thoughts on this, this wonderful study, and you've obviously seen all of it, all 170 pages of it. If there's one thing that you want folks to take away from this when it comes to the mental health portion of this, and the findings in this study, what stood out to you? What do you want us to take home with us tonight?
Well, for me, it's that if we're going to address and support the mental health needs of Asian American Pacific Islanders, is that we all have an important role to play in meeting those needs, whether you're in a school district, whether you're in the faith-based, whether you're elected official, trying to find opportunities like today to have this conversation, to begin the discussion, to model the vocabulary where we're supporting emotions and mental health. And then I think there's some really concrete tenets that the report outlines of looking at those social determinants of health, looking at violence and safety, and trying to embed some of the mental health supports within those tenets.
And I think as Michael said earlier, mental health is health. I think that's a prominent message we'd like to continue. I think the other piece is, for those Asian Americans in the room, finding a way for self-care that works for you. I think of us in the community as the heart of our community, and the heart always pumps blood to itself first. So if we're not taking care of ourselves, we can't take care of our communities. And so my message is to find some way, whatever works for you, that feels like you're taking care of yourself.
Okay. Well, can we get a round of applause for the commissioner and doctor? Okay, moving on to the API curriculum conversation. We got 4, as we mentioned, panelists, wonderful panelists. If I can have you join me up here, Julie Chin from Make Us Visible, which has been amazing, by the way. Rachel Estroff from Senator Meyer's office, Chief of Staff. Here, yep. Fran Willis, Regent Fran Willis, and the Ardsley School Superintendent Ryan Schoenfeld. If you will join us up here, have a seat. So fitting, by the way, that we're having this conversation today. There was actually a bus of demonstrators from the city that went up to Albany today to demonstrate about this issue in Albany with Senator John Liu. This has been actually an issue for me that I have been very close to for the past several years. And I'll tell you the thing that really struck me, to put this into context. A couple of years ago, I profiled a remarkable young woman. Her name was Ashlyn So. At the time, she was 13 years old. She was on the cover of Teen Vogue. She was in New York for her third New York Fashion Week. She was a young designer. And she sort of became what she describes herself as an accidental activist because of all of the anti-Asian hate that year. And then that year, she dedicated her collection to anti-Asian hate. But she talked about in her own community that she was an advocate for getting this curriculum taught. And this is the moment that struck me, right? So she's 13. She grew up in the Bay Area, and I'm thinking, you know, what does a child growing up in today's world and a diverse community like the Bay Area know about, you know, facing bias and racism and hate? How naive of me, right? And she broke down in tears in that interview because not only did she experience it, obviously, but she struggled to find her place in American history, her belonging in this country. And so I bring that story up because often we frame this discussion as if this is like some lesson to the non-AAPI. But this is also just as important to our kids. I certainly know, and this was mentioned before, but my Marjorie didn't grow up learning about Vincent Chin until college, right? And that maybe is connected to the mental health component, right? Like you grew up in a country where you don't know where your place necessarily is because history and the classroom doesn't tell you that you have a place. With that being said, let me sort of bring you guys up to speed what's going on, and you would certainly be well versed in this, but in New York, where we stand right now, so the neighboring states of Connecticut and New Jersey have passed this. New York, Senator John Liu, and I believe the co-sponsor in the assembly was Assemblymember Grace Lee, right? They introduced this bill. It's been introduced 2 years in a row now, right? And it has not passed. And so the reason why it has not passed is a little bit complicated. Let me sort of set that up first before we dive into this conversation. So in states like New Jersey and Connecticut, there were pre-existing mandates to teach ethnic studies like Black history. In New York, that does not exist. So in those states, what was simple, they just added an amendment, 3 lines, you add AAPI history, great, done, right? Just like in Florida, which is, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but it's a little bit bizarre, the rationale there. But in New York, does not pre-exist. And so it's a little bit more of a haul to get, as a precedent, all of this mandated. Some of this, and this is my understanding, is a fraction of the opposition is likening it to critical race theory because now it's being lumped into Black history studies. But from my understanding, it's not really that, right? In New York State, the Department of Education has historically been free of political interference. And while that might sound like what happened in Florida, from the way it was explained to me, is that's actually a good thing in some ways because it doesn't allow what happened in Florida to happen here. But that being said, now we're sort of stuck in this moment where legislators don't want to overstep and I guess tell the regions what to do, right? So that's sort of a long-winded setup for a conversation that I want to have now about where we stand. So let me start with Make Us Visible, Julie, which has been so instrumental in this legislation being passed around the country. Where are we right now?
Where are we? So Make Us Visible is a national organization. As Stefan had mentioned, you know, there has been legislation that's been passed in Connecticut and New Jersey and Rhode Island, most recently in Florida as well. We are New York State. So although it is a national organization, we do have to look at it state by state because we all have different ways that we implement different curriculum, right? Make Us Visible has 3 major tiers that we focus on, and that goes with education, with community, and with legislation. I consider myself a very community-oriented person. I've been on a school board in Nassau County at Herrick School District for 10 years. This is my 11th year now. I accidentally became also an advocate, an activist, however way you put it.
Those are the best kinds, by the way.
You know, because it just turned out that I have a passion for this. I have a passion for lots of things, and I also have FOMO, and I want to be part of big things. And I really believe that there's big things happening. If you ask me on a personal level, I don't think it takes legislation to make sure that education is in the schools. As a board member, I know that our school district already implements much of AAPI contributions and histories. And that's one of the things that we really push for, is taking it back locally. That's why we partner with our communities. We partner with different organizational leaders and with educators and administrators and whatnot, because it doesn't take legislation to do what's right and to bring it back to your communities. My home school district happens to be over 60% Asian. We have a very small number of Hispanic and African-American community within our school district, but that does not take away from the fact that we still implement that into our curriculum. And same should go for Asian American contributions and histories in other districts where their population might not be at 60%. It might not be at a majority. It might not even be at a small majority, but does not take away from the fact that we should still implement it and we should share our stories. We said mental health is health. Asian American history is American history.
Yeah, and I should mention, even though the state hasn't passed this law, there are 900 school districts in the state that have gone ahead and implemented this, including all the major ones, including the city of New York, which last year started a pilot and this September now fully integrates that. So that's an important distinction. This next question, I'm gonna ask this to, I guess, Fran first, and then Rachel can take this next after that. With that all being said, what, in your opinion, what's the most likely scenario to get this curriculum into our classrooms? Would this require individual districts, as I mentioned, to go on their own? And are there current policies that school districts can lean on to cooperatively offer this curriculum without the state doing it? Like, what's the future look like here? Sure, you can go first.
Okay, so I guess I'd like to start by saying that can people hear? Every school district in the state of New York is required to cover standards that you'll find by going into the NYSED website. The standards in New York State include Asian American history throughout, from the very beginning of the way we have standards that talk about elementary school, where they study the different communities, or the middle schools, where they start to further that understanding through actual events in history, and in our high schools, where in US history and global history, every classroom, every teacher of those subjects must cover the history, for example, of the Exclusion Act, of the railroads, of the original Silk Road, in the global history of the internment camps, but I'm talking about much more detail than that. Those are the major areas, but all of this is outlined in the standards. Now, what the state cannot dictate is how these standards are actually taught in the classroom, how they're covered, what type of curriculum, the time that is spent, the kind of projects that you have in the classroom. Those are determined by the individual school districts. So curriculum is really governed by the boards of education in every district. This is where I believe any type of intervention or interest or communication needs to take place. So it would take place with the superintendent, with the school boards, with the election of school board members who are asked questions about the curriculum. How is this covered? So yes, the Constitution of the United States deferred to the states. Topic, one of the most important topics, probably one of the most important places where our lives are shaped, public education. Deferred that to the states. Then at the states developed local school boards. There are pluses and minuses that I won't go into now, because I could give a lecture on this, but the plus is it actually gives a community an opportunity to interact and intervene, if you will, in a positive way to explain. And by the way, every school board meeting has a time for the public to comment on subjects that are not on the agenda. And at that time, you can discuss the issue that you bring, which may be, in fact, the way the curriculum in that includes Asian American history, the way that is presented in your particular school. I want to add one more. I don't want to dominate, but I would like to add an important area that the regions did develop, and they developed it before the pandemic and are still working on this. This is the culturally responsive sustaining education framework. I urge you to look it up on the website, CRSE. I've sent the material to Marjorie Shu to send out to share. I sent the link. That framework gives districts, again, cannot be required, but it is becoming more and more a framework for curriculum and instruction in schools. What are the 4 basic principles of the curriculum framework, of this culturally responsive framework? You can hear from the first 2 words, culturally responsive. And so the first principle, a welcoming and affirming environment. That is the key to true community, and to true community for students, where they feel that they belong and they are seen. That's the first principle of the classroom and the culture that is developed in a school. You, as community members, have a right to, from your students, from your children, hear about what the culture is like in your school. Do they feel welcome? Do they feel affirmed? Number 1. Number 2, a rigorous curriculum, and a curriculum that reaches for excellence and equity. Number 3 is that the curriculum itself is inclusive and the instruction is inclusive. That means that all of the stories of the students in your classroom are included in the way you are teaching. And finally, most important also, professional development, so that the teachers understand how to create this kind of environment in the classroom. It is my belief that the next step for this framework, we should be including a literature guide, because one of the most important aspects of education and building empathy for all the groups in schools is reading about yourselves, reading about reading the stories, the literature. That's what builds empathy. So the reading list, I feel, is something they used to have more of a reading list, if you will, not one that's required, but that is suggested. And then that reading list includes authors representing all of the groups in the community, and so that students see themselves. And it was very interesting that yesterday's New York Times book review included a book called Biting the Hand, it's called, by Julia Lee, about finding her identity as an Asian American in her community. And she actually became a professor of African American history, and I believe it's Berkeley, but I'm not sure. I can't remember the university she's at. But the book talks about her search for identity as an Asian American. The way we learn is hearing the stories and making sure that in a classroom those stories are told, and reading books that develop, reading books, the artwork, that's extremely important. The arts are very significant. And this is how we develop empathy for our students and in our schools. We cannot require a particular curriculum. We can require the standards, which we have, which do cover all of these areas.
Rachel, I definitely want to hear from you, but Fran, I am a journalist by trade and I see a thread that I want to pull on. The pro in defense of that argument, which the way it was framed to me, right? You can't require it. So on the flip side, you can't like, which you know, to use the only example, it's obvious here in Florida, you can't require it to be stripped away either, right? So it's that sort of protects, right? You mentioned the pro and con. What's the con then?
Con, of course, the pro and con of local is that we can have schools that are banning books. And we have to take our, our autonomy as an agency, as citizens, to look at the people who are in charge of your curriculum, your school boards, and you have a right to, question and to vote and to run. This is how democracy works in action, and it's so.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your honesty. Rachel, Senator Mayer has been a huge advocate of the community as far as I've known her. It's been many years. Your point of view, what's your answer to this?
I largely agree with both speakers, but I would just add that I think that one of the things that legislation does, even if it is not enacted, is that it really pushes the conversation. And I think that's one of the things that has been most effective about this legislation, whether it passes or not. I think there is appetite, quite honestly, to pass it, but I think that it would probably do less than people expect that it would, as bills suggested, because much of this is in place and much of this, they're doing a lot of that work already. But I do think that it really pushes the conversation, and I don't think it's one or the other. I think you push the legislation, you push your local school boards, and that's how you get.
That's interesting. So you're saying that it would probably do less than we expect because in your estimation, the state of New York in the different districts is kind of ahead of the curve on this. Like we're already, like I mentioned, 900 school districts already doing this. So it's almost like it's not.
Or I would say that the Board of Regents creates the framework, and much of that framework is in place. So if people are thinking, as Fran was saying, that that there's going to be curriculum coming from it, that probably wouldn't happen.
I see. Okay.
Can happen in the school district, in
Right.
where you live.
Right.
Yes, it can.
So that's a perfect segue then, Mr. Superintendent. So given what you just heard here, what do you envision AAPI curriculum looking like in Westchester County or in your own district?
Well, I think it all starts with the welcoming and affirming. Our communities have changed over time. When Ardsley was a community when I was going to school, Caucasian might have been 95%, I'll say. So Ardsley now is about 59%. And as you saw on the slides, one of the growing populations of Asian Americans and our Pacific Islanders. So that's a noticeable difference within our community. And we have to listen to our community and work with them. I know at the state level, it's always nice when they again, put a framework or provide some room for you to move forward. But within our own community, it's finding ways to work with your local government. So we have a great relationship with Mayor Kabulian, and there is a group that meets about cultural responsiveness and how we can set up opportunities to meet with one another. So there are some softer things, I'll say, but yet important. Also, most recently too, it was the voice of some of our students that said at a focus group, we're not recognized. There are all these other holidays. There are holidays we're not seen. So the same idea of, making sure people are visible. When we did the focus group and then followed up with a survey, we had, in a small district, we have about 2,300. We had 1,200 people respond to this survey. So anyone that does quantitative or qualitative, that's a big voice, I'll say. So we listened to that, and what was most, it hurt my heart a little. There was about 24% that said, I don't feel like my holidays can be observed as I would want to. So there are places like New York City and Yonkers that made that move forward, and Scarsdale was having some conversation about this, but we looked at calendars in the Lunar New Year, which again, it's cyclical and will change every year, but we looked at a 5-year forecast. So in the next 5 years, we'll be recognizing Lunar New Year and Diwali and Eid al-Fitr, which we're the first ones, I'll say, in the area to add all of those. But it did have people recognize there was a pride behind it. We typically don't do media events, and it wasn't to be recognized, but more or less to show that we are committed and we are listening and we are moving forward. And when we talk of representation as well, I think the books, of course, we want to see ourselves, have our students see themselves in the books, but we also need to hire highly competent teachers as well that mirror our students. And as I was talking to one of our leaders who is part of the Asian Student Union, they meet with their high schoolers and go to the elementary school during the International Festival and speak with them. And they're trying to be ambassadors of their culture as well. And I think that's very important, and we've done that. The other thing that happens within small districts is, as we're a smaller district, we do have teachers that represent certain students that other counselors just can't. They don't know a language. And the other night we had a serious situation with one of our students talking about self-harm, and contacted our administration, and we were able to contact one of our teachers, and there was a connection there and able to talk through. Again, when you talk about difficult things, this was one of those that we were able to navigate through and get some help to the family. And again, culturally, normally that wouldn't happen, but we had resources, I'll say, in the way of a highly competent teacher that again could relate to that family and speak to them in a different way. So I think that representation is very important. As again, our communities change, we also have to seek ways to hire people that can mirror our community.
That's really interesting, especially the part about the high school kids talking to elementary grade school kids or middle school kids. Is that like a structured program, or is that the kids just volunteering to do that?
It's a structured program for one of our clubs. The
Oh,
Asian Student Union Club will go down and they do some work with Taekwondo, but it gives you that interface with the younger children. And again, the word was used, trying to create ambassadors. You know, again, within your curriculum, we want to do that. There's also, I'll just add to it a string, my assistant superintendent's here. He's worked on some policy as well, that if we have policy about curriculum, to make sure that we can maintain the curriculum and not lose that. So again, having a system in place that you could have an advisory group to look at something, not just one person saying yes or no, but to try to protect what is being taught, like Regent Wills was saying.
did you want to add something, Fran? Yeah.
I just like a couple of things I'd like to add. First, I wanted to note that on the Board of Regents, there are two Asian American regents, Judith Chin, who represents Queens, and Shino Tanakawa, who represents Manhattan. So we do have a more and more diverse group on our Board of Regents. It wasn't always that way. I also wanted to add that while it's very important for the students in your district to see themselves in the books and in the history, it's very important, it's crucial that we have representation of all of our ethnic groups and racial groups in books and in curriculum throughout this nation and in every community in New York, because that is the way we build the larger community that we are seeking. That is the goal of this nation, what was created. So, you know, it's very, very urgent, I would say, at this point, urgent that history of Asian American and Pacific Islanders is taught in all of those states where there was this beginning of the Asian immigration in this country. So they understand, because in many of those states, they are now changing their curriculum to have less and less in that. That is our real, I think, our tremendous, tremendous issue right now nationwide.
Julie, what's it been like working in states without the curriculum, and how did you like flip the script in those states
That have already,
that didn't have it before you got involved and your group got involved?
so Yeah, basically it started with a conversation. It started with a conversation basically after some of the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, where parents got together with some teachers locally in Connecticut, and they decided, let's do something about this. And basically, even from the findings that we find here in the reports, one of the best ways to combat anti-Asian hate is through it. Very simple start, right? It's very bold, and it's very simple. We just move forward and we just try to work together, and we see where we can go with incorporating contributions and histories. And I do want to say also, it's not just about the different tragic things in our histories, but also celebrating all of the good things. And people will say there's studies, like if you ask people to name a famous Asian American or who do they think of, the numbers of the people that we know is so few and far between. And it's because, I was born and raised in the States, and I haven't learned much about it, and my kids were born and raised in the States and they don't know much about it. So it's about accessibility, and I think that being a school board member, my other hat, to create these mandates, especially when they're unfunded, and it just becomes pressure on educators. That's the last thing that any of us want, whether it's me as my Make Us Visible state director hat or as a school board member hat. We want to be able to make things accessible, to make things inclusive, and not have to change the entire game, but just to bring ways and bring as Fran Wills had said, like to bring things into literature, bring things into history, bring things into the lessons, so that it's part of what these students are already learning, but it becomes more inclusive and it looks like, like the students.
So you're talking about, like, instead of creating a whole new curriculum for API history, I know there's a group in Georgia that did this, you sort of integrate that because it's all connected, right? When you teach civil rights, walking side by side with Malcolm X was an AAP activist. So that way teaching it can be a little more integrated and it's not right.
I mean, that's my personal opinion. I mean, there's going to be lots of different people who write curriculum and who will have different thoughts in this. But, like even New York City, they have the Hidden Voices, the Hidden Figures curriculum now, and that includes so many of our AAPI pioneers. And I think that when we continue to do this little by little, it becomes an organic growth, and it won't become so burdensome on the school districts or on the teachers or on the educators who have to bring this to the students.
And I would imagine, like, as more states do it, it gets a little easier, right? For the next states to look and say, hey, they're doing it. No, I mean.
I would think so. I would think that once the bigger states have buy-in, then it's easier because of, textbooks, because of taking the lead of the larger states. And, I think it's critical, as we already said, so many districts here in New York kind of implement it little by little in their own ways, whether it's in their histories and in their literature or even in their holidays, like we had mentioned. All of this leans way to acceptance and for being seen and feeling visible for the students. And I think our end goal, I don't care what district you're from, every educator, I think, has the heart of wanting to do what's right by their students. And that includes if there's even one Asian student or somebody who identifies as Asian in their student population, they're going to want to embrace that student and make sure that they feel included and that they feel understood in some ways. And I think that everybody has the right heart to do it. Maybe they just don't know how to do it just yet. And the more we can get this out there with the language and the accessibility, I think that it just makes it so much better for all of the districts throughout all of the state to be able to adopt something like this.
Rachel, did you want to jump in here?
I was just going to add that I really do think that is the goal, is to have it integrated in a way that it's not an afterthought, that it really is integrated into the curriculum and the history and the literature and the art.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So Regent Willis, I know it's been pretty clear where the regents and the State Board of Education stands on the mandate, but you mentioned the guidance. So let's talk about that, right? Because that's I guess the pathway forward from your position. In terms of getting that guidance to go the direction you want to and not the other direction, right? Which unfortunately is happening in some places. In your view, what's the critical steps to ensure that we get closer to that goal then? Getting that guidance, getting that out there.
I think first of all, I think as we move the cultural framework into more of an understanding through teacher education programs, through professional development, and by adding some guidance with literature, we start to expand what is available. When you have teachers together and you're learning about different books that you can use in your classroom, when you're understanding how you evoke stories from your students, how you develop this welcoming and environment, that is a very important step. So I think the teacher education and those kinds of resources, there is also the opportunity for teachers to annotate and work together collaboratively to bring their favorite books to the table, new books perhaps that they've explored and know about to the table to annotate and share with others. Recently, I attended a conference at Scholastic Books, and Scholastic Books is coming out with a diverse books program, and they are developing books for younger children for all of the different our schools. And this is a very powerful way to bring, because Scholastic is highly used in our schools. And so if teachers have these books on their bookshelves and are teaching them in the classroom, these are stories about students from all different, including a whole series.
Yeah. Before I open this thing up to questions, I'm sure there's a lot of them. I hope there are, because this is an important topic. Sort of drilling in on the last question I just asked, and this can be for anyone. In terms of, I guess, the roadblocks that may be standing in the way to get to that goal, is it fair to say that, at least in this state, maybe it's not political, but we have to accept that teaching is a very difficult profession and sometimes subjective. And you're talking about, like you just mentioned, getting teachers into one room and agreeing on a curriculum, and teachers have to be taught this as well. Is some of this that is just the teaching profession itself is just not always black and white, for instance? I mean, I guess each of you can sort of lend your voice to this. What would be the biggest roadblock then to getting to that point?
I think we do have professional development opportunities in our school district, certainly Westchester. And that's an area also where this state education department also runs webinars, but it's better to bring people together so they can collaborate on books they're using, the themes, way they're teaching. These are the best ways to make change in a school. But that's, again, up to the tenant and to the curriculum people in the schools. But to me, the place that you want to go with the teachers. They understand the whole process. And I think the cultural sustaining framework is the very core.
I mean, look, educators generally dislike when legislators tell them how to educate. So that's kind of like the well, not so we went a well-kept secret. Mr. Superintendent, I guess, maybe let me ask you this. When's the last time the curriculum in your district has changed dramatically, and what was that? Like how often do we see that happen?
Well, sometimes we'll have drastic changes. Common Core is a good example,
Common
which
Core,
was
right.
2012. But then we'll have assessments change, which again, backward design. Then you start to look at what you're teaching and how. So there are changes that occur. I think there's a resource out there that's sometimes unknown, which we have BOCES, a consortium.
Common Core, though, was mandated, right? So
Yeah.
we're talking about, I guess, in this case, if it was not mandated, and this, I guess, would be the district, I guess, in some ways voluntarily taking this step, right? Is there an example in recent memory you can think of where the curriculum dramatically changed without the mandate?
Like I said, I think some of it happens due to the assessments and
Okay.
what's changing. If like your global test is going to be different, or they're asking for different ways that you have to show what you know. And that will have an impact on how you teach and what's best practices. The BOCES consortium, we have many people that meet on regular basis. So our curriculum leaders, our administrative assistant superintendent will meet with BOCES. They're getting information directly from the Commissioner of Education and the Board of Regents. So whenever there are changes, I'll say there, it filters down to that next level, which I see as BOCES. And we often will get services through BOCES. They become facilitators, if it be technology, if it be curriculum, staff development. They become specialists with some of the different resources we might use.
Sounds like you're
Again,
saying change can happen and does happen and has happened.
yeah, I think that's probably the way I foresee it.
Okay.
And every community is slightly different, but oftentimes I think there's a lot of networking. Again, I've experienced it through my role during COVID. And when you think of the government that worked with us, but our colleagues, we all pulled together during that time. When you work on curriculum and you have common things that you're shifting towards, people do work together.
I imagine
People do talk.
superintendents talk to each other as well.
Yeah,
Is this sort of curriculum, API history, something that has been a conversation between other superintendents?
No, not specifically, but because our district in Scarsdale started looking at the holidays differently, that came up recently to say best practices. So let's talk about Westchester now. Every community is a little different. How do we go about bringing in focus groups with parents and students, having an activity that I say was more authentic, and then move towards the survey, which came back to a board meeting. We presented that. So some of those systems, we're going to share that internally. But after tonight, I'll definitely be talking.
Yeah, I was
to
gonna ask you,
colleagues.
want to be the superintendent to
So,
start that conversation?
Yeah, so the next meeting, I'll be
That's
bringing
on
it
the
up.
record, by the way.
We can count on it.
Anybody else want to jump in here before we open this up to the floor?
I was just gonna say that I do think, and I say this as not so much in my senator mayor capacity, but having served on a school board and having a husband who's a teacher, that very often at that level, there are choices that teachers make about changes in their sort of the books that they're choosing to have their students read. That those sorts of changes in curriculum happen all the time.
And if I can also add, I mean, we talk about different curriculums being added and changed. I know that, different districts will look at different math curriculums and they'll look at different teaching styles of how to read. And, are they bringing in the Columbia style? Are they bringing in this style, that style? And, I'm a firm believer of lifelong learning, and I think that that's really the base of every educator that's not only here in our state, but just all over the place. We're lifelong learners. And as Maya Angelou said, we do our best until we know better. And when we know better, we do better. And I think that that's what it really comes down to is once you know something, you're going to want to try to do better by it, whether it's your students or the curriculum or the holidays or whatever it might be. When we didn't know, we didn't know. We didn't know. We were naive. We didn't know. But now we're starting to understand and we're trying to bring this back to the school districts. And now that the conversations are being had, I think that we all must rise up to do better by our students and by our communities.
I know better to know that when you invoke Maya Angelou, it's time to open this up to the people. So how often do you guys get 4 individuals like this sitting at one table? I mean, I hope you have some questions because floor is yours. Anyone want it? There we go. Or on the flip side, it's almost like the other side of that is like in this district that's majority white, the very student that may have not been exposed to someone else is not getting that. So that question, which I think is a question, seems to be directed to you, Fran. So I'm gonna let you take that one.
No, well, it's a tough one. And because first of all, the standards are mandated. So the requirement is there to teach about these subjects. The issue you're talking about is much more related to the culturally responsive and sustaining framework, which, while not a mandate, is part of the guidance that our regions have developed, which talks about how instruction is delivered and how we make sure that every student is seen. And this is where I believe we need to do more work even at higher ed as we work with new teachers coming in to help them understand how to make sure that every student is seen in the classroom. This is also where books help different, an array of books that allow students to be seen. and you start this conversation, and I think this is where Rachel's point about the legislation starts the conversation. It does. It heightens.
Having the
the
conversation now.
Yes, it heightens that need that people see, oh, to take a look at this, at the standards, take a look at the culturally sustaining framework and what that means. It needs to be emphasized throughout the state of New York.
And if I may, you've said a few times, and I didn't miss this, that the standards are mandated.
Yes.
So then, to be more specific, what is specifically in those standards that would satisfy that concern?
The history of Asian Americans in and that is required. Every one of the events also required is that in the early grades that there's a cultural appreciation, and usually it's the community. There's a study of community in first and second grade. So everyone's culture in that classroom is required to be identified, so that in a way that's appreciated. I should say appreciated.
So Julie, is that enough? Yes or no, and why?
Is it enough? I mean, so I mentioned that at Make Us Visible, we have 3 pillars that we kind of go by, and that's education, advocacy, legislation, and community. So my answer would be, there's a bunch of folks of us who are working on the legislative side. There's a bunch of folks who are working on the education side, and where the community side comes into play is that very thing. I think that we are our own biggest advocates. We are our own biggest cheerleaders. Growing up, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, one of maybe 3 Asians in any of the schools that I've ever attended. By nature, I'm a little bit outgoing. I'm a little bit loud. I like to tell my teachers, hey, can we learn about this? Or can I bring in this? Can I share this? I get that not every person has that kind of personality, but we as a community can get together. If we were talking about a different issue, if we were talking about special needs, there would be no question. If there was even one student that has a special need, the school would meet those needs. So these might not be special needs, but they do fulfill a need in these students. So that's where the community can kind of come together. A family can come together. If there's one student that feels that they are not visible or that they're not understood, whether it be because of their holiday or because of the books that they're reading, or if it's because of, whatever it might be, it could start with small conversations that can lead to really big conversations. That's where Make Us Visible kind of came from, was that conversation. And I think that we can all work together to do what we can do best.
Sounds like you didn't really answer my question, but we're all allies here. We'll stay friends. I'm not going to push you on
No,
that. In the back, your hand was up first. Rachel, I think that one's for you probably.
In-
Good
I-
question, by the way.
Yeah, I do think that's a good question. And I think that the challenge would be that we then need to adopt that for every ethnic group. And I mean, maybe we should, but I think that's some of the challenge that, the state Senate or the state legislature has right now, is that in addition to the AAPI legislation, there's legislation for transgender students, and all of this needs to be done. It's just whether or not it should be done through legislation. And that's, I think, I don't know that I really have the answer to that.
Just to clarify, we sort of talked about this, right? That's the pro that you spoke about, that in this state, that teacher could not be removed, right? Because the board doesn't enforce or mandate what can and can't be taught. Is that the way the law is in New
School
York?
board can.
The school board can.
I'm not talking about removal,
Right.
but there can be, some type of practice that, remedy for
Right.
that teacher. But the teacher, but if that's part of the school's curriculum, there is definitely a consequence for not covering that material. I just want to point out something, if I may. Same issue. This issue came up recently because there is legislation in New York State that you must teach the Holocaust. You also have to teach, by the way, in New York law, you have to teach care and kindness to all animals That's part of New York State law. So there are certain legislation that has tried to create these requirements. But the Holocaust piece, teaching of the Holocaust, it is a requirement. And every school must teach it. Well, it is in the standards. The Holocaust, just the way the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Holocaust is in the standards. Well, the way that they tried to find out through the legislature questioned how it was being taught and what was being done. So a survey went out to all the schools in New York State and asked if they were teaching the Holocaust. And every one of the schools said yes. How they taught it, what they did, some of them gave good explanations, but we don't know really what was done in those classrooms or how it was taught. And in some schools, it was in depth. Perhaps they read Anne Frank, perhaps they did, had Holocaust survivors there. And some schools, it was just touched because in most cases, that's because their communities did not include people who were Jewish. So that's a big issue because the communities without any Jewish people in it are the ones who may have people who are reading social media and
Right,
looking
that was
at
the point sort of raised by the first question.
horrible hate messages and have no idea. So this is quandary. This is a dilemma. It's not easily breached, but it's something that we need to think of.
So again, this is the journalist in me. I have to keep prodding here now. So you're thinking about it. How torn are you about this?
How torn am I?
Yeah.
I'm a regent and I follow the priorities, and I believe that the cultural framework is the place to go because it starts with a welcoming and affirming environment. And so start with recognizing all of the different people in classes, but also we have to think about all of the different people.
Can I invert his question? So he asked what happens to a teacher who maybe teaches something he or she shouldn't have, right? And you mentioned sort of the reverse of that, that there's a standard, and if you don't teach to that standard, there's a consequence. So what's the consequence for not meeting that standard?
That again goes to the school district. That's the school district's role as to how they handle that.
Gotcha.
And how they bring that up. I mean, it can be, and it
Some
can
of the
be.
tests do also,
Yes.
so districts will have consequences on the exams that then will, so there is some accountability.
If the
of,
teacher is asked about the scores on the exam, what questions students could answer. I mean, but that's not really where we want to go with this. This is not where we want to go with this. We have a huge.
Educators generally hate more tests. That's been clear. There's a question in the back, yeah? I'm glad I'm not the one answering that question.
Well, we actually have programs to try to develop a more diverse teaching force. And many of our higher ed programs are working to do that. We're also creating fewer obstacles to certification to try to broaden the base from whom, where we have our emerging teachers. So we are doing things in that area.
Do legislators determine that amount of funding? The funding that you just talked about, the legislators determine that? You're nodding your head, right? Okay, so then the answer is you call your legislator, right? Because if the funding is there right, am I wrong, right? The funding is there to fund what he's talking about. And if the legislator in your district would determine the funding, that's where you call, right? Am I right there? Okay.
I can speak to it some. We're in Westchester. People say what they want to. They come out loud and clear. We need leaders that are willing to step up to the plate, take the opportunity when they have a mic in front of them to say, we need to do what's best for our children. So it's part of the leadership as well. There's different hierarchies, but I know personally, again, we were going through COVID, horrible time. Like, again, I appreciate what you all did during that time, but I also recognized that we needed to put this work forward, and we started that with DEI work, which was, again, many things, but that welcoming and affirming, like, Regent Wills said, not all districts, it's not required. So it's a framework. You're supposed to be doing this. It's good things. Again, we embrace that and we move forward with that. So it does happen, and it has to be that leadership that's willing to, I say, shake the tree a little bit, because some people are going to feel uncomfortable. And if people are maybe losing some way or thinking, well, if we do this, then I'm not going to be in that power position. And I just look at it too, the easiest way, it's about tailwinds. We're trying to create as many tailwinds for all of our community, our students, and try to minimize those headwinds that are in the way of others that we don't recognize. So there are a lot of structural things there.
Yeah,
and
I
we
don't,
could-
I don't. Exactly. I was gonna say, I don't think that's a really good answer. Leaders like you, Rose and Julie. I mean, if parents convince parents, I mean, he's gonna listen to what parents say, right? So it's kind of up to parents to convince other parents to tell him what to do. So it's actually, I think,
So, being a past PTA president 4 times over and council VP twice over, I think a lot of it is conversation again, because it's almost like that question of, who's your favorite child? Is number 1 or number 2 or number 3?
you know, you have one.
You don't like the things that we can teach are endless, right? Just because we teach one thing and show one thing doesn't mean that we necessarily are taking away from something else. And especially if it's something like in this situation where it's extracurricular almost, where it's not a mandated part of curriculum, but it's something that's added on. I think that part of the buy-in is maybe part of the conversation that's had of why we need it, why we should introduce it, why we should have it. And making sure that the community understands that this is for the benefit of all. It's not taking away, it's not saying, if we have a Lunar New Year celebration that we're taking away the January 1st, New Year celebration. It's not like that, but it's kind of celebrating all. And I think that, I know that when I was PTA president, there was like this stigma where around the winter holidays, everything was a snowman or a snowflake. We were very careful. We never said Merry Christmas. We never said Happy Hanukkah. Instead of being all inclusive, we were kind of just be happy holidays and keep it at that, but to some extent, why don't we celebrate everybody and everything and teach about everything? We're not saying you must believe in this. We're just saying that there are people that celebrate Christmas, that celebrate Kwanzaa, that celebrate Hanukkah. And we don't have to always just stick to the snowflake or snowman, to get away from all of that. Let's be more inclusive and show what our student population is celebrating. I think that Marjorie had mentioned how many languages we have, how many religions we have. Let's showcase a little bit of all of it, as much as we can anyway, and keep on growing from there. And I think that that's how we educate and how we get to learn more about each other and how we become friendly with each other.
Okay, we hit time, but I'm gonna be at that bad reporter that can hear the producer in my ear rapping me, but going over time. Because this is a good conversation. Can we squeeze one more in here maybe?
And also, we didn't have the opportunity for questions for our behavioral health speaker, general questions. So I'm
You're still
sure
here, so
I'm
yeah.
sure we could keep this esteemed panel going all night. But I just wanted to also give people the opportunity to ask broader questions.
Yeah. There was hands that I didn't get to. Squeeze one more in, and hopefully everyone's kind of lingering. We can, jam them after this is over. Yeah, sure. Awesome. Which municipality, Mr. Mayor? Oh, okay. I would love, but I don't know what, did we get kicked out of here at some point? I don't even know what time we kicked out. Look, I hope that we can linger and maybe we can have conversations that continue, maybe one-on-one, two-on-one, right? But in the meantime, this was awesome. Like, I learned a lot. I hope that you learned a lot. Thank you. Mark. The AAAB, to the county executive. Let's hope that this was a conversation starter for both of these topics and more, to just take this back to your communities and continue that conversation.
Thank you, Safan. Thank you, everybody. I passed around this, speaking of seeing yourself in literature, this graphic novel was developed by the Asian American Foundation. If you have multiple children, grandchildren, there's additional copies in the back. If you're a child yourself at heart, feel free to take as many copies as you would like. But this, this is trying to address the fact that we all need to see ourselves in books and movies and music and art, as well as the curriculum. So thank you.
Thank you. Get home safe.
Can I just add one more thing to what
Of
Marjorie
course,
said?
yes.
Sorry. Make
One more
us,
thing.
Make Us Visible. Make Us Visible has a coloring book that we put out, which is free to educators. I wish I had brought some with me, but I didn't have any on hand. If you email hello@makeusvisible.org, they will send you a copy of the free coloring book, and that has 25 Asian American pioneers throughout the United States.
You're all over social media. You can
Yes.
find them.
Hello@makeusvisible.
Thanks. That was very honest. I appreciate it.